Maybe depends on how we feel, I guess. We have Rabbi Asher Meza, the one and only. Thank you for coming by. TorahJudaism.com. .org or .com? I always forget.
Both. Both.
Oh, good. Both redirect. Good. We also have special guests, Jack, and, of course, my co-pilot, Wade, who wanted to set up this Thursday night for a really buckled down and really hard-hitting Q&A. We want to get to the bottom of Judaism. What is Torah? What is Judaism? What does it all mean?
I think the purpose tonight is really to give everyone the fundamentals of Judaism, all-encompassing. Oral law, written law, or what people call oral law, because there is no monolithic understanding nowadays for the oral law. And I think that's where the biggest confusion arises. If you ask 5 different rabbis, what is oral law, you'll get like 20 different opinions. And still, they don't want to step on anyone's toes, unless they're my toes. I think that the reason the Karaite movement is growing, and not just the Karaite movement, Black Hebrew Israelites, every ism out there that has arisen because of the behavior of Jews, I think it's a result of Jews not breaking things down. And the truth is, most rabbis don't know how to break it down because they've been also fed the same nonsense. They're just regurgitating what their rabbis told them. I think logic and reason is one of my strong suits. And equipped with the teachings of the Rambam was also very logical, very reasonable. And Judaism nowadays claims to be made up of the Rambam. For sure, his concepts, but his concepts get twisted towards mystical avenues that he never really endorsed.
Basically, you dig Kabbalah, you dig Chassidut, but it's not exactly the fundamentals of Judaism. Judaism, right, on a fundamental level, is pretty much Torah, which is written Torah, and then oral Torah, which is Mishnah Torah, and that's pretty much it. And the halacha that follows. Yeah, you can believe in the fluff and the cherry on top and all the wonderful other things that encompasses Judaism and Jewish people, but it's not the when we say fundamentals, it's not fundamental.
We're going to deal with things that are obligatory to believe. Now, that's something that never comes out of a fanatic's mouth. The way a fanatic teaches, whether he's Christian or Jewish, is that everything is obligatory to believe, especially if he says it. And I think that's a primitive approach. I think the more sophisticated approach, it's seen a lot in Judaism, but not in mystical circles, that things could be permissible but not beneficial. Some things could be allowed, and it's just silly. If something doesn't appear in the Torah, that doesn't mean that you're not allowed to believe it, but one shouldn't think that God expects you to believe it or requires you to believe it. And this is something that's really missing in dialogue today. What's obligatory and what's opinion? Only because something's opinion doesn't mean it has to be disposed of. Judaism today, the bulk of it is all opinion. And there's beautiful concepts. There's beautiful concepts in Kabbalah. There's beautiful concepts in Hasidut, but it's opinion. And heck, the majority of our religious walk is all opinion, whether we realize it or not. Now, this is a religious show. The average person doesn't even accept Torah, the average irreligious individual. The question is, what does Judaism, i.e. the religion that came out of the Torah, what does it require you to believe based on what the Torah says itself? Now, if some concept was developed after the Torah, then by definition, it's of a lesser stature, by definition. And one can't say that it came directly from God. And these are tools that are never utilized nowadays when religious talk occurs. If a rabbi says something, you're expected to accept, you're expected to believe. And if you don't, the first thing they say, oh, well, you don't believe in the oral law. Now suddenly every lesson, every topic taught by a rabbi gets lumped into oral law just because they're trying to get those ideas canonized, just like Torah is canonized. Everything is oral law. Like if you ask a rabbi, what is the oral law? He's never going to be able to tell you what is the oral law because it keeps on growing every year. That's what I really want to try to explain today from a logical, purposeful, reasonable perspective.
I appreciate that. That was a nice breakdown, and it's a nice summary. Basically, we're dealing with Torah and fundamental Torah, and that's the 5 books of Moses. That's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and of course, Mishnah Torah, Halacha. That's it. So, Jack, take it away. You're first on the chopping block. I hope you bring your big boy questions. Nice to see you again, though. It's good. It's always good to see a friendly face.
My first question is from the Torah. Explain Sabbath. The what, the where, the how, the why. Just basic, fundamental Torah Sabbath.
According to the Torah alone, there is no consensus on how the Sabbath is to be kept. What we do know is that the Sabbath must be kept. The question is, how does one keep such a requirement, especially when a requirement has a death penalty attached to it if one keeps it wrong, which means that the elders, which existed in the time of Moses, if you read the Torah straight through, Moses pals around not just with his brother, the priest, and his brother's children, but with a group of elders. God tells Moses to establish 70 elders, 71 with himself, judges that were there to build consensus. So there has to be a consensus in every generation on how the Torah is going to be kept if there are death penalties attached to not keeping certain commands correctly. So there certainly was a consensus on how the Sabbath was kept, but that doesn't mean that consensus was given on Mount Sinai. To the point that we see that when the man is gathering sticks on the Sabbath, Moses doesn't know what to do. If all the requirements of keeping the Sabbath and all the how-tos were given on Mount Sinai, how did Moses not know what to do? It says that he went and he consulted with the elders. He went near the tent, and then they came back with the ruling. And that's what we consider oral law today. The consensus we're speaking about is that of the court, the elders, the men of the great assembly. They went by many different names, and they ruled certain precepts into existence to give us some standard to help us progress in a uniform manner. They established 39 melachot. The Torah doesn't say to rest on the Sabbath. It says don't perform malacha. Malacha has been translated to mean creative labor, just because that phrase is not used anywhere else in the Torah. So we don't really know exactly what it means. But the consensus of the elders is that the labor that's prohibited is creative labor. Melacha, not avodah, because avodah just means work. But you're technically allowed to work on the Sabbath, but what you're prohibited from doing is melacha. So the consensus was brought down that the things that weren't done in the Torah when they were building the Mishkan, that is what was going to be prohibited. But that had to be decided upon. Now, the average rabbi will tell you, no, well, this was given to you on Mount Sinai. That's too simplistic. One doesn't have to believe that. Now, there are legends that teach that, but what we do know, at least according to what the Torah says, the Torah doesn't say there was another standard given on Mount Sinai, but it does say that we have to listen to this court. So either way, we have to keep these laws that either came from or through the judges, the elders, the Sanhedrin, the men of the Great Assembly. According to the Torah alone, there is no way to keep the Sabbath in a uniform manner. That means that we'd be keeping the commandment just like Karaites keep commandments. One interprets it this way and one interprets it that way. Now, the truth is, traditional Karaism had a standard called the Sevel HaYerusha, which is the yoke of the inheritance. They also had their own oral law. I really don't like using that phrase oral law. I think it appears maybe twice in the Talmud. But the proper phrase is halakha, the proper way of doing things, the proper way to walk down the path, what's fit, what's acceptable, what there is ultimately a consensus on. So according to the Torah alone, we would not be able to keep the Sabbath in a unified manner. These laws were meant to be kept in an agrarian society from a nationalistic perspective. If I only had the Torah alone, I'd be keeping the Sabbath differently than you'd keep it. And I wouldn't be able to eat in your house on the Sabbath because I would consider you wrong and you'd consider me wrong just because we'd have different opinions. But everyone was subservient to the rulings of that court. Deuteronomy says that if we disagree with them, we'd be disagreeing with God.
Yeah, it is fascinating how when the Torah talks about building a Mishkan, usually the parsha that follows or within that parsha, it does talk about keeping Shabbos. It's a very interesting how that always lines up if one ever reads the Torah and finds that connection. That is actually how they come to that conclusion. No, that whenever the Mishkan is talked about, Shabbos is also talked about. No,
that is one source given for where they got the 39 categories of labor for the Sabbath. In my opinion, they just developed them. But this court had the authority passed down from Moses that said God was going to put on the elders what he put on Moses. And Moses even passed it down to Yehoshua, which is called smicha. It's ordination. It's authority to judge and to rule. So I don't like that phrase when they say, well, that one can't even keep the Torah properly if they don't have rabbinic law or oral law. That's not true. Not the bulk of the Torah, not for sure the ethical portions in the Torah, but ceremonial law. The only way you're able to enforce these laws on a nation, you would definitely need a consensus on how it's done. So I like the word consensus better than oral law. There's a consensus by the judges, those who we call Chazal, on how the nation was meant to keep Shabbat. Now, it's hard to understand these laws in exile. It's hard to understand Judaism in exile. it's a system set up for a nation with borders and their own language, really an agrarian society. So this is why religion, Judaism, even Christianity, got so spiritualized. Everything legal became spiritual because it didn't really mean anything, or it lost its meaning in the exile. But yeah, go ahead.